The biting wind howled across the snow-covered plains of Kansas like a hungry wolf searching for prey. Elizabeth Lawson clutched her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as her trusty mare, Penny, trudged laboriously through the deepening snow. The December of 1871 had brought an unusually harsh winter to the frontier, and Elizabeth was beginning to regret her stubborn decision to make the journey from Topeka to Ellsworth alone. "Just a few more miles, girl," she whispered to her horse, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We'll be at Uncle George's ranch soon enough." The 22-year-old had always prided herself on her independence, a trait that had both impressed and frustrated her late parents. Following their passing 6 months prior, Elizabeth had chosen to leave behind her life as a schoolteacher in Topeka to start anew with her only remaining relative. Her uncle's letters describing his successful cattle ranch near Ellsworth had painted a picture of opportunity that she couldn't resist. The storm had intensified over the past hour, the snow now falling in thick, heavy curtains that obscured the landscape. Elizabeth's fingers, despite her thick gloves, had grown numb, and she could no longer feel her toes inside her boots. Penny's pace had slowed considerably, each step becoming more labored than the last. Suddenly, a mournful howl pierced through the wind's roar. Penny's ears pricked forward, her entire body tensing beneath Elizabeth. "Easy, girl," Elizabeth soothed, patting the mare's neck. "It's far away." Nothing to the second howl came closer, followed by another and then another. A wolf pack, and they were on the hunt. Penny reared without warning, her front hooves pawing at the air as a primal fear overtook her. Elizabeth, caught off guard and with numbed fingers unable to grip the reins properly, felt herself sliding from the saddle. She hit the snow-covered ground with a dull thud, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. "Penny." She cried out, watching helplessly as her terrified horse bolted away into the swirling white. "Come back." But the mare was gone, leaving Elizabeth stranded in the middle of an unforgiving winter prairie with wolves closing in and night rapidly approaching. She struggled to her feet, her ankle protesting sharply as she put weight on it. Sprained, most likely, but not broken small comfort given her dire circumstances. With painful determination, Elizabeth began limping in what she hoped was the direction of Ellsworth, the snow now reaching mid-calf. Each step was agony, and the bitter cold seemed to penetrate through to her very bones. The wolf calls had faded, but whether that was good or bad, she couldn't tell. As darkness began to fall, desperation clawed at her throat. The temperature was plummeting with the sun, and Elizabeth knew that without shelter, she wouldn't survive the night. Her steps became more faltering, her breathing more labored, and the temptation to simply sit down and rest grew overwhelming. Just as her strength was about to give out entirely, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the storm's fury. Elizabeth tried to call out, but her voice emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. She waved her arms frantically, praying that whoever was approaching would see her through the snow. The dark silhouette of a rider materialized from the white void, the powerful form of a horse moving steadily through the storm. As they drew closer, Elizabeth could make out the broad shoulders of a man beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his face partially obscured by a bandana pulled up against the cold. "Help," she managed to croak as the rider pulled his mount to a halt beside her. The man's eyes, a striking blue that reminded Elizabeth of summer skies, widened in surprise as they took in her bedraggled state. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and touched with concern. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here alone in this blizzard?" "My horse," Elizabeth explained, teeth chattering. "Wolves. She threw me and ran." Without another word, the stranger dismounted in one fluid motion. Up close, Elizabeth could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements suggesting the easy strength of someone accustomed to physical labor. He assessed her quickly, noting her favoring of one foot. "You're hurt," he stated, removing his glove to touch her cheek with surprising gentleness. "And half frozen too. We need to get you warm fast." Before Elizabeth could respond, he had swept her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. She gasped at the sudden movement, but found herself clutching at his sheepskin coat, grateful for the warmth radiating from his body. "I'm Lucas Hayes," he told her as he carefully lifted her onto his horse's saddle. Ranch foreman at the Double Creek spread about 4 miles east of here. Elizabeth Lawson, she replied through chattering teeth. I was heading to my uncle's ranch near Ellsworth. Lucas swung up into the saddle behind her, his solid chest pressing against her back as he reached around to take the reins. George Lawson's your uncle. Well now, that's something. He's a good neighbor to have. He wrapped one strong arm around her waist to keep her secure, then urged his horse forward. Hold tight, Miss Lawson. My cabin's closer than your uncle's place. We'll get you warmed up, then I'll send word to George that you're safe. Elizabeth nodded weakly, finding herself leaning back against the stranger's broad chest. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the unexpected security of Lucas's arm around her waist lulled her into a strange, dreamy state despite the biting cold. Stay awake, Miss Lawson, Lucas urged, his breath warm against her ear. Talk to me. Tell me what brings a lady like yourself to this unforgiving country. Fighting the dangerous drowsiness, Elizabeth forced herself to respond, explaining about her parents' passing and her decision to join her uncle. Lucas listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that required her to focus and stay alert. As they rode through the deepening darkness, Elizabeth became aware of a gradual change in the landscape. The open prairie gave way to more varied terrain, with the shadowy forms of cottonwood trees appearing along what must be a creek bed. Eventually, the welcome sight of a cabin came into view, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Here we are, Lucas announced, relief evident in his voice. Not much to look at, but it's solid and warm. Indeed, the cabin appeared sturdy if modest, built of hand-hewn logs with a small porch across the front. A barn stood nearby, its door secured against the storm. As they approached, a dog's bark sounded from within the cabin, followed by eager scratching at the door. Lucas helped Elizabeth down from the horse, supporting her weight as she balanced on her good foot. Lean on me, he instructed, leading her toward the cabin while the horse followed dutifully behind. The door swung open before they reached it, and a young boy of perhaps 12 years stood framed in the golden lamplight, a large brown dog dancing excitedly at his side. Liam, Lucas called out, stable thunder for me, would you? This lady needs warming up right quick. The boy nodded, his curious gaze taking in Elizabeth's bedraggled appearance before he hurried to take the horse's reins. Lucas guided Elizabeth inside, the welcome heat of the fire washing over her in a wave that made her skin prickle painfully as sensation began returning. The cabin's interior was simple but tidy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the main room, while cooking implements hung neatly from hooks near a cast-iron stove. Elizabeth glimpsed 2 doorways leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. Sit here by the fire, Lucas directed, helping her to a rocking chair draped with a colorful quilt. He knelt to remove her snow-encrusted boots, his touch careful as he examined her swollen ankle. Not broken, I don't think, but a bad sprain for certain. Elizabeth winced as he gently manipulated her foot. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, if you hadn't come along when you did. Lucas, he corrected, rising to his feet and removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Without the shadow of his hat brim, she could see his face clearly for the first time, strong-jawed and weathered from years in the sun, with those remarkable blue eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. Elizabeth guessed him to be in his early 30s. Let me get you something hot to drink, and then we'll see about getting you into some dry clothes, he said, moving to the stove where a coffee pot sat keeping warm. The front door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air along with the boy and dog. The child stomped his boots on the threshold, his cheeks ruddy from the brief exposure to the elements. Thunder's settled with extra hay, he reported, unfastening his coat. His eyes, the same striking blue as Lucas's, regarded Elizabeth with undisguised curiosity. Miss Lawson, this is my brother, Liam, Lucas introduced, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. Liam, Miss Elizabeth Lawson. Her horse threw her in the storm. She's George Lawson's niece. Old man Lawson has a niece, the boy asked, his expression brightening with interest. Does this mean you'll be staying at his ranch? That was my plan, Elizabeth confirmed, wrapping her stiff fingers around the warm mug gratefully. Though at the moment, I'm simply thankful to be alive and out of that storm. I'm in your brother's debt. Liam shrugged off his coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. Lucas is always bringing home strays, he said matter-of-factly, earning a sharp look from his brother. Last month it was a half-dead calf. Month before that, it was Ranger here. He patted the dog's head affectionately. Liam, Lucas said in a tone that suggested the boy should mind his manners, fetch one of my shirts and a pair of your trousers for Miss Lawson. They'll be too big, but they're dry. As the boy disappeared into one of the bedrooms, Lucas turned back to Elizabeth. You'll have to excuse him. We don't get many visitors out here, especially not. Ladies, Elizabeth managed a small smile. It's quite all right. He seems like a good boy. He is, Lucas agreed, his expression softening. Been just the two of us since our parents died in a fire 5 years back. I was 29, Liam just 7. Moved out here from Missouri to start fresh. I'm sorry for your loss, Elizabeth said sincerely. It seems we have that in common, at least. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, broken only when Liam returned with the promised clothing. I'll step outside while you change, Lucas said. There's a screen in the corner you can use for privacy. Liam, come help me check on that loose board in the barn. Once alone, Elizabeth struggled out of her sodden dress and petticoats, her fingers still clumsy with cold. Lucas's shirt hung nearly to her knees, and Liam's trousers, secured with a length of rope, were comically short but blissfully dry. She laid her wet clothing near the fire to dry, then sank back into the rocking chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. She must have dozed off, for the next thing she knew, Lucas was gently shaking her shoulder. Miss Lawson, Elizabeth, I've made some stew. You need to eat something warm. Elizabeth blinked awake, momentarily disoriented before remembering the events of the afternoon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep. No need to apologize. Your body needs rest after what it's been through. Lucas helped her to the table, where Liam was already seated, eyeing the steaming bowls of stew eagerly. The meal was simple, a hearty mixture of venison, potatoes, and wild onions, but to Elizabeth's hunger-sharpened senses, it tasted better than any fine restaurant fare she'd ever sampled in Topeka. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing appetite as warmth and strength began to return to her body. This storm's likely to last through tomorrow at least, Lucas observed, glancing toward the window where snow continued to accumulate on the sill. I'm afraid you'll be our guest a bit longer than you might have planned. I don't mean to impose, Elizabeth began, but Lucas waved away her concern. It's no imposition. We can't very well send you back into that blizzard, especially not with that ankle. Besides, Liam's enjoying the company, aren't you, boy? Liam, mouth full of stew, nodded enthusiastically. After swallowing, he asked, were you really a school teacher in Topeka? Do you know lots of books? Can you teach me about geography? Lucas tries, but he's not very good at explaining things. Liam, Lucas admonished, though there was no real heat in his tone. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at the boy's eager curiosity. Yes, I taught children about your age, and I'd be happy to share what I know while I'm here. After dinner, Lucas insisted that Elizabeth take his bed while he would sleep on a pallet by the fire. Despite her protests, he was firm on the matter. A gentleman doesn't let a lady sleep on the floor, he stated simply, in a tone that brooked no argument. Besides, you need proper rest to heal that ankle. Too exhausted to debate further, Elizabeth accepted his gallantry with grateful thanks. The bedroom was small but neat, with a hand-carved bed frame supporting a surprisingly comfortable mattress. A small table beside it held a lamp and a well-worn copy of the Bible. The only other furniture was a chest at the foot of the bed and a hook on the wall where several shirts hung. Elizabeth slipped beneath the quilt, surrounded by the unfamiliar but not unpleasant scent of Lucas, haze a combination of saddle leather, wood smoke, and something uniquely male that she found oddly comforting. Despite the strangeness of her situation and the lingering ache in her ankle, Elizabeth fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to the mouth-watering aroma of frying bacon and the sound of male voices conversing quietly. Sunlight streamed through the small window, catching dust motes in its golden beams. For a moment, Elizabeth lay still, orienting herself to her surroundings and the events of the previous day. Her ankle throbbed dully as she sat up and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Testing her weight cautiously, she found she could stand, though not without discomfort. She straightened Lucas's borrowed shirt as best she could and limped to the door. The main room of the cabin was flooded with morning light. Lucas stood at the stove, expertly flipping bacon in a cast iron skillet while Liam set the table. Both looked up as she entered. "Good morning," Lucas greeted, his smile warming his eyes. "How's the ankle?" "Better, thank you," Elizabeth replied, suddenly self-conscious of her appearance and the borrowed men's clothing. "Though I'm afraid my dress may not be fully dry yet." "I hung it near the stove overnight," Lucas said, nodding toward a makeshift clothesline where her dress and undergarments swayed gently in the heat rising from the stove. "Should be ready after breakfast." Liam pulled out a chair for her with exaggerated formality that made Elizabeth smile. "Thank you, kind sir," she said, playing along. "We don't often have such fine company for breakfast," the boy replied with a wink. Lucas set a plate of bacon, eggs, and biscuits before her. "The storm's let up some, but there's still too much snow for safe travel." "I figure we're all staying put today." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a curious mix of relief and disappointment. "My uncle will be worried." "I thought of that," Lucas said, joining them at the table. "If the weather clears enough by midday, I'll ride over and let him know you're safe." "That's very kind of you." Liam, already halfway through his breakfast, looked up hopefully. "Since you're staying another day, could you maybe teach me something? Lucas has some books, but he's too busy most days to help me with the hard words." Elizabeth's heart warmed at the boy's eagerness to learn. "I'd be delighted." After breakfast, true to his word, Liam produced a small collection of books, a reader, a basic arithmetic text, and a somewhat outdated geography volume. Elizabeth settled into the rocking chair, her ankle propped on a stool, while Liam sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, drinking in her explanations with rapt attention. Lucas moved about the cabin, attending to various chores, but Elizabeth noticed his frequent glances in their direction, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth whenever Liam answered a question correctly or showed particular enthusiasm for a new concept. By mid-morning, the storm had indeed lessened, though the snow remained deep. Lucas donned his heavy coat and hat, preparing to make the journey to George Lawson's ranch. "I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours," he told Elizabeth, pulling on his gloves. "Liam knows what to do if the fire needs tending. There's stew left from last night for your midday meal. Please tell my uncle not to worry," Elizabeth said, "and that I'm being well cared for." Lucas nodded, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment before he turned to Liam. "Mind your manners, little brother, and no pestering Miss Lawson if her ankle pains her." "Yes, sir," Liam replied with mock solemnity, earning a ruffle of his hair from Lucas before the man stepped out into the snow-blanketed world. With Lucas gone, Elizabeth continued Liam's impromptu lessons, but also took the opportunity to learn more about their host. The boy was eager to talk about his admired older brother, painting a picture of a man who worked hard, kept his word, and put family above all else. "Lucas could have sent me to live with our aunt in St. Louis after the fire," Liam confided. "She wanted him to, said raising a boy was no job for a bachelor, but he wouldn't hear of it, said we were family and family sticks together." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Elizabeth observed. Liam nodded emphatically. "He is, works harder than anybody I know. The ranch owner, Mr. Sullivan, says Lucas is the best foreman he's ever had, says one day Lucas will have his own spread, sure as anything." "Is that his dream, to have his own ranch?" "Yes, madam, he's been saving for years. Has his eye on a piece of land about 10 miles south of here. Says in another year or two, he'll have enough to make an offer." Liam's pride in his brother was evident in every word. As the day progressed, Elizabeth found herself increasingly curious about the man who had saved her life. There was something about Lucas Hayes that intrigued her, a quiet strength, a dignity that seemed rare in her limited experience with frontier men. The afternoon was waning when the sound of hoofbeats announced Lucas's return. Liam rushed to the door, Ranger at his heels, as his brother stomped the snow from his boots on the porch. Your uncle sends his regards, Lucas told Elizabeth as he hung his snow-dusted coat by the door, and his thanks. He was indeed worried when you didn't arrive yesterday. Sent out a search party, but they turned back when the storm worsened. Was he very upset? Elizabeth asked, concerned about causing her uncle distress. Relieved, mostly, Lucas assured her. He's a good man, your uncle, invited me to stay for coffee, wanted to hear exactly how I found you. He paused, a smile tugging at his lips. He also mentioned that he wasn't surprised you'd attempted the journey alone, said stubbornness runs in the Lawson family. Elizabeth felt a blush warm her cheeks. He's not wrong about that, I'm afraid. He's sending a wagon for you tomorrow, weather permitting, Lucas continued. Says the trail should be passable by then, and he's eager to welcome you properly to Ellsworth. Elizabeth nodded, surprised by the pang of disappointment she felt at the news. Her time at the Hayes cabin had been brief, but there was something about the simple honesty of life here that appealed to her deeply. That evening passed pleasantly, with Lucas joining Liam's lessons, his deep voice reading aloud from one of the boys' books while Elizabeth rested her ankle. After Liam was tucked into bed, Lucas and Elizabeth sat by the fire, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic her life in Topeka. His dreams for the future, shared memories of parents now gone. I never thought I'd find myself so comfortable in the company of a man I've known for barely a day, Elizabeth confessed as the fire burned low. Lucas's eyes reflected the dancing flames as he regarded her thoughtfully. Sometimes a day can tell you more about a person than years of casual acquaintance. What has this day told you about me then? She asked, both curious and slightly apprehensive about his answer. That you're brave, he said without hesitation. Determined. Kind to a boy who pesters you with endless questions. Quick to smile despite your circumstances. He paused, adding more softly, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with your appearance, though there's no shortage there either. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken at his words, at the earnest appreciation in his gaze. And what has it told me about you? She mused aloud. That you're a man of honor, that you care deeply for your brother, that you work with your hands but dream with your heart. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop and crackle from the fire. Elizabeth found herself studying Lucas's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight cleft in his chin, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks in the firelight. I should thank you again for saving my life, she said finally. I'm not sure I've expressed my gratitude adequately. Lucas turned to face her, his expression serious. Anyone would have done the same, but it wasn't anyone, it was you. Elizabeth held his gaze steadily. And I am very glad that it was. Something shifted in Lucas's eyes, then a warmth, an acknowledgement of the connection forming between them, but he merely nodded, rising to his feet with reluctance. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Elizabeth slept fitfully that night, her dreams a confusing mixture of howling wolves, swirling snow, and a pair of summer blue eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of her uncle's wagon. Elizabeth dressed in her now dry clothing, grateful to feel like herself again, though she would miss the comfort of Lucas's shirt. Her ankle, while still tender, had improved enough that she could walk without significant pain. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Liam uncharacteristically quiet and Lucas focused on his plate. The impending separation hung over the table like a cloud, making conversation difficult. I've wrapped some biscuits and bacon for your journey, Lucas said as they finished eating. It's still a fair distance to your uncle's place. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, touched by his thoughtfulness, for everything. Liam pushed his empty plate away, his expression glum. Will you come visit us sometimes? You promised to tell me about the oceans and the foreign countries. Elizabeth smiled gently at the boy. I'd like that very much if your brother doesn't object. Lucas shook his head. No objection here. You're welcome anytime. The sound of an approaching wagon drew them all to the window. A sturdy farm wagon pulled by 2 draft horses was making its way down the snowy trail toward the cabin, an older man with a full beard at the reins. That'll be Jim Parker, your uncle's foreman, Lucas explained. George mentioned he'd be sending him. Elizabeth felt a curious reluctance as she gathered her few belongings. Stepping outside onto the porch, she blinked in the bright sunlight reflecting off the pristine snow. The world looked transformed, beautiful in its winter garb. Jim Parker tipped his hat respectfully as he pulled the wagon to a halt. "Miss Lawson, your uncle sent me to fetch you home." "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I appreciate you making the journey." Lucas carried her small travel bag to the wagon, lifting it easily into the bed before turning to help Elizabeth up to the seat. His hands at her waist were strong and sure, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Safe travels, Miss Lawson," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed something far less formal. "Remember what I said, you're welcome here anytime." "Goodbye, Lucas," Elizabeth replied, her voice not entirely steady. "Goodbye, Liam, thank you both for your kindness." As the wagon pulled away, Elizabeth turned to look back at the cabin. Lucas and Liam stood on the porch, the dog beside them, all three watching her departure. Elizabeth raised her hand in a final farewell, a strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal in the snow. Jim Parker was a man of few words, for which Elizabeth was grateful. Her thoughts were too tumultuous for idle conversation. The journey to her uncle's ranch took just under an hour, the wagon moving steadily through the snow-covered landscape. George Lawson's spread was considerably larger and more prosperous than Elizabeth had imagined from his letters. The main house was a substantial two-story structure of weathered wood and stone, with several outbuildings and corrals surrounding it. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the windows glowed with lamplight despite the morning hour. The front door opened as the wagon approached, revealing a tall, silver-haired man whose resemblance to Elizabeth's late father was striking enough to bring tears to her eyes. "Elizabeth," he called, striding toward the wagon with long steps that belied his 60-odd years. "Thank God you're safe." Parker helped her down from the wagon, and then she was enveloped in her uncle's bear-like embrace, the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and wool bringing a fresh wave of emotion. "Uncle George," she managed, returning his hug fiercely, "I'm so sorry to have worried you." He held her at arm's length, his keen gray eyes so like her father's examining her face. "You're here now, and that's what matters. Though I must say, your father would have had strong words about your traveling alone in such weather." Elizabeth smiled ruefully. "I'm sure he would have. It wasn't my wisest decision. Come inside, child, Mrs. Holloway has breakfast keeping warm, and I want to hear every detail of your adventure." He led her toward the house, one arm still around her shoulders. "Though young Hayes already gave me quite an account. Fine man, that one, salt of the earth." The interior of the ranch house was warm and welcoming, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and walls adorned with paintings and photographs. A plump, motherly woman in an apron greeted them in the entryway. "So this is our Miss Elizabeth." "Lord have mercy, child, what an ordeal you've had. Come in, I've hot coffee and fresh biscuits waiting. Mrs. Holloway is my housekeeper and the finest cook in Kansas Territory," George explained as they moved into a spacious dining room. "She's been with me since my Martha passed, going on 15 years now." Elizabeth was shown to a chair at the large oak table where a place had been set in anticipation of her arrival. Mrs. Holloway bustled about, serving coffee and bringing platters of food from the kitchen, clucking sympathetically over Elizabeth's sprained ankle. "Now then," George said once they were settled with full plates, "tell me about yourself. Your letters were always too brief. And then, I want to hear exactly how you came to be rescued by Lucas Hayes." Over the next hour, Elizabeth shared her story, her life in Topeka following her parents' deaths, her decision to accept George's invitation to come west, and finally, the harrowing experience in the blizzard and her rescue by Lucas. George listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing her to speak uninterrupted. When she had finished, he nodded thoughtfully. Providence was looking out for you, sending Hayes along that trail when he was needed. He's not usually one to be out in such weather unless absolutely necessary. He mentioned he works as a foreman, Elizabeth inquired, trying to sound merely casually interested. A knowing smile touched her uncle's lips. "Yes, for the Sullivan Ranch to the north." Good position, though I suspect he won't be in it much longer. He's been saving to buy his own land clever with his money, that one. Not like some cowboys who spend every cent on whiskey and cards the minute they're paid. Mrs. Holloway, refilling their coffee cups, added her own assessment. A proper gentleman, Mr. Hayes is, despite his rough exterior, raises that brother of his right proper too. The boy's got manners that would put some of the town children to shame. Elizabeth nodded, remembering Liam's eager intelligence and natural courtesy. He's a credit to his brother's care. Indeed, George agreed. Hayes has had his share of hardship, losing his parents the way he did, taking on a child at his age, but he's never complained, never asked for help or special consideration. The conversation gradually shifted to Elizabeth's plans now that she had arrived in Ellsworth. George explained that he had prepared the east bedroom for her use and that she was welcome to stay as long as she wished. "This is your home now, if you want it," he told her warmly. "I've no children of my own, as you know, having family here. Well, it means more than I can say." Touched by his sincerity, Elizabeth reached across the table to squeeze his weathered hand. "Thank you, Uncle. I'm grateful for your generosity." The days that followed fell into a pleasant routine as Elizabeth settled into life at the Lawson ranch. Her ankle healed quickly, allowing her to explore her new surroundings and learn about the operations of a working cattle ranch. George proved to be patient teacher, clearly delighted by her genuine interest in his life's work. Mrs. Holloway took Elizabeth under her wing, introducing her to the rhythms of frontier housekeeping skills that her city upbringing had left her woefully unprepared for. Elizabeth threw herself into these lessons with characteristic determination, finding unexpected satisfaction in mastering tasks from bread making to preserving. A week after her arrival, George announced at breakfast that he would be riding to town for supplies later that day. "Would you care to join me, Elizabeth? It's time you were properly introduced to Ellsworth society, such as it is." Elizabeth readily agreed, eager to see the town she had heard so much about. She dressed with care in one of her better dresses, a forest green wool that complemented her auburn hair, and donned her warmest coat and bonnet. The town of Ellsworth, while small by Eastern standards, was bustling with activity when they arrived shortly before noon. The main street boasted a general store, a bank, a hotel with attached restaurant, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. "Not as rough as some cattle towns," George commented as he helped Elizabeth down from the wagon. "But lively enough during drive season when the cowboys come through." Their first stop was the general store, a large, well-stocked establishment owned by a round-faced man named Harold Jenkins, who greeted George like an old friend. "So this is your niece." "We've heard so much about you, Miss Lawson," Jenkins said, beaming at Elizabeth. "Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves a daring rescue in a blizzard." Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm at the realization that her misadventure had become common knowledge. "I fear I've provided the town with more gossip than I intended," Jenkins chuckled good-naturedly. "Good news is always welcome here, Miss Lawson, and your safe arrival is certainly that." As George conducted his business, Elizabeth browsed the store's offerings, marveling at the variety available even in this remote location. She was examining a display of fabric when the bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. "Hayes, good to see you," Jenkins called out. "Unusual to find you in town midweek." Elizabeth turned, her heart giving a peculiar little jump at the sight of Lucas standing in the doorway, his tall frame filling it impressively. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing slightly tousled dark hair that curled at the collar of his coat. His eyes found her immediately, a smile breaking across his face that transformed his rugged features. "Miss Lawson, you're looking well, Mr. Hayes," she replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been moments before. "What a pleasant surprise." George emerged from the back of the store, a list in hand. "Lucas, just the man. I was hoping to catch you in town. Got a matter I'd like to discuss if you have time for a coffee at the hotel after my errands." "I'd be obliged, Mr. Lawson," Lucas replied, though his gaze kept returning to Elizabeth. "I've some time before I need to head back." "Excellent. Elizabeth and I were planning to take our midday meal there anyway. You'll join us." Lucas hesitated, glancing down at his work clothes clean but well worn. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense." George dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "Elizabeth would enjoy the company, wouldn't you, my dear?" Put on the spot, Elizabeth could only nod, though in truth, she was eager for the chance to see Lucas again. Very much so. The hotel restaurant was modestly elegant by frontier standards, with tablecloths and proper silverware. Several diners looked up with interest as George led their small party to a table near the window. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way, particularly from a group of well-dressed women at a nearby table. Lucas pulled out Elizabeth's chair with unexpected gallantry before taking his own seat. "How are you finding Ellsworth, Miss Lawson?" "I've seen very little of it so far," she admitted, "but what I have seen seems charming." "Elizabeth has been busy learning the ways of ranch life," George explained proudly. "Mrs. Holloway says she's a natural with bread making, though the same can't be said for her first attempt at chicken plucking." Elizabeth laughed, not at all embarrassed by her uncle's teasing. "I maintain that no one is a natural at chicken plucking. It's a thoroughly unnatural activity." Lucas's eyes crinkled at the corners, and Elizabeth found herself captivated by the genuine warmth in his smile. "Liam asks about you nearly every day. Wonders when you might visit to continue his geography lessons." "I would be happy to, whenever it's convenient," she replied, pleased that the boy had remembered her. "Perhaps you could both join us for Sunday dinner at the ranch," George nodded approvingly. "An excellent idea, Mrs. Holloway always prepares enough for an army." Lucas accepted the invitation with evident pleasure, and their conversation flowed easily throughout the meal. Elizabeth found herself repeatedly drawn to his quiet humor and thoughtful observations. Unlike many men she had known, he listened as much as he spoke, genuinely interested in her opinions. After their meal, George excused himself to speak with the bank manager across the street, leaving Elizabeth and Lucas alone at the table. "Your uncle is a good man," Lucas said, watching George's retreating form through the window. "Respected by everyone in the county." "I'm fortunate to have him," Elizabeth agreed. "After my parents died, I wasn't sure what direction my life would take. Coming here, it feels right somehow." Lucas studied her face for a moment. The frontier isn't an easy life, especially for a woman accustomed to city comforts, but there's something about it that gets into your blood: the openness, the freedom, the sense of building something meaningful. "Is that why you stayed after your parents died, rather than returning east?" He nodded slowly. "That and Liam, he was born here, it's the only home he's ever known, and I wanted." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I wanted to give him roots, I suppose, stability. A place that's ours." "Your land south of here?" Elizabeth asked, recalling what Liam had told her. Surprise flickered across Lucas's features. "Liam mentioned that, did he?" "Yes, there's a parcel, good water access, decent grazing. The owner's an elderly man looking to move to California to live with his daughter. Says he'll sell to me when I have the full amount." "It sounds like a dream worth pursuing." Lucas's gaze held hers steadily. "It is, more so now than ever." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken under his intense regard, aware that their conversation had shifted into deeper waters. The spell was broken by George's return. "All set," he announced cheerfully. "And I've invited Lucas to join us for the Cattlemen's Association meeting at our place next week." Several ranchers gathering to discuss spring preparations. The remainder of their time in town passed quickly. Lucas accompanied them to a few more stops before taking his leave, citing the need to return to the Sullivan Ranch before dark. His farewell to Elizabeth was formal but warm, his hand lingering on hers perhaps a moment longer than propriety strictly dictated. As they drove back to the ranch, George cast a sideways glance at his niece. "Hayes is a fine man." Elizabeth, gazing at the winter landscape, merely nodded, unwilling to reveal the tumult of emotions that their brief reunion had stirred in her. "Not one for idle flattery or empty gestures," George continued casually. "When he gives his word, you can count on it being kept, rare quality these days." Uncle George, Elizabeth said with mild exasperation, are you perhaps attempting to matchmake? The older man's eyes twinkled mischievously. Would I do such a thing? I'm merely commenting on the character of a neighbor, though I will say I've never seen Lucas Hayes quite so attentive at a social gathering before. Usually keeps to himself, says what needs saying, and leaves. Elizabeth felt a flush of pleasure at this observation, but kept her expression neutral. He was simply being polite to a newcomer. If you say so, George replied, his tone making it clear he believed otherwise. In any case, we'll be seeing him again on Sunday, Mrs. Holloway will be delighted to have guests to fuss over. Sunday arrived with clear skies and milder temperatures that hinted at the eventual arrival of spring, though winter still held the land firmly in its grip. Elizabeth found herself unusually particular about her appearance, changing her dress twice before settling on a becoming blue wool that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. Mrs. Holloway, bustling about the kitchen in preparation for their guests, noticed Elizabeth's attention to detail with a knowing smile. That Hayes boy won't know what hit him, she murmured to herself as she checked her roast. Lucas and Liam arrived promptly at noon, both dressed in their Sunday-best clean shirts, polished boots, and hair neatly combed. Liam carried a small package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Elizabeth with a formal little bow. It's a thank-you gift, he explained as she unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden box with a hinged lid. Lucas made it for you. I helped with the sanding. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the smooth surface, admiring the delicate leaf pattern etched into the lid. It's beautiful, she said sincerely, looking up at Lucas. Thank you both. It's not much, Lucas demurred, though pleasure at her reaction was evident in his expression, just something to keep small treasures in. The meal that followed was a merry affair, with Liam regaling them with tales of his adventures with Ranger, and George sharing stories of the early days of his ranch. Elizabeth observed the easy camaraderie between her uncle and Lucas, noting how the younger man deferred to George's experience without sacrificing his own dignity. After the meal, while Mrs. Holloway served coffee and George entertained Liam with a checkers game, Elizabeth seized the opportunity to speak privately with Lucas. Would you care to see the gardens? She suggested. They're dormant now, of course, but Uncle George says they're quite impressive in spring. Lucas readily agreed, and after donning their coats, they stepped out into the crisp winter air. The garden paths had been cleared of snow, allowing them to walk side by side between the bare rose bushes and sleeping flower beds. Your uncle has created something remarkable here, Lucas observed, gesturing toward the expansive ranch grounds. It's a testament to what determination and hard work can achieve. He says much the same about you, Elizabeth replied. He has great respect for what you've accomplished, especially with Liam. Lucas's expression softened at the mention of his brother. Liam makes it easy. He's a good boy with a quick mind, deserves more than I've been able to give him so far. I think you underestimate the value of what you have given him: a loving home, stability, your time and attention. Those are worth more than any material advantages. They had reached a small gazebo at the far end of the garden, partially sheltered from the wind by a stand of pine trees. Lucas gestured for Elizabeth to precede him up the steps, and they sat on the wooden bench, a respectable distance apart yet close enough to converse comfortably. May I speak plainly, Miss Lawson? Lucas asked after a moment of companionable silence. I wish you would, she responded, sensing the importance of what he was about to say. Lucas turned slightly to face her, his expression earnest. I've not been able to put you from my mind since the day we met. I know it's sudden, unconventional, but there's something between us that I can't explain and don't want to ignore. Elizabeth's heart raced at his forthright declaration. I've felt it too, she admitted softly. I have no right to speak of such things, he continued, his gaze steady on hers. I'm not a wealthy man, and my prospects, while promising, are still uncertain, but I believe in being honest about my intentions. I would like your permission to call on you properly with your uncle's blessing. I would like that very much, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. And I think you'll find my uncle more than amenable to the idea. Relief and joy transformed Lucas's features. I had hoped, but didn't dare presume. In a gesture that surprised them both, Elizabeth reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the bench between them. Sometimes a day can tell you more about a person than years of casual acquaintance, she quoted his own words back to him with a smile. Lucas turned his hand to clasp hers gently, the warmth of his touch spreading through her despite the winter chill. You remember. I remember everything about those 2 days, she confessed. They changed the course of my life in more ways than one. They remained in the gazebo, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams until the lengthening shadows reminded them of the passage of time. As they walked back toward the house, Lucas kept a respectful distance, yet there was a new understanding between them that needed no physical expression. George's pleased expression when they returned suggested that he had anticipated this development and heartily approved. The remainder of the afternoon passed pleasantly, with Lucas formally requesting permission to call on Elizabeth in the future, a request that George granted with barely concealed satisfaction. As the Hayes brothers prepared to depart, Elizabeth walked with them to where their horses waited. Liam, having extracted a promise that she would visit soon to continue his lessons, mounted his pony with a cheerful wave. Lucas lingered a moment longer, taking Elizabeth's gloved hand in his. "Until next time," he said simply, his eyes conveying far more than his words. "I'll look forward to it," she replied with equal simplicity. In the weeks that followed, Lucas became a regular visitor at the Lawson ranch. His courtship of Elizabeth proceeded with a deliberate pace that reflected his serious intentions. They rode together across the winter-touched prairie, attended church services in town, and spent long evenings by the fire discussing books, dreams, and the future. George observed their growing attachment with evident satisfaction, often finding reasons to make himself scarce when Lucas called. "Young love needs room to breathe," he explained to Mrs. Holloway, who was equally invested in the romance blooming under their roof. February gave way to March, and the first tentative signs of spring began to appear across the Kansas landscape. The Cattlemen's Association meeting brought several neighboring ranchers to the Lawson property, providing Elizabeth with her first real introduction to the wider community. Lucas, as George's guest, stayed close to Elizabeth throughout the gathering, his quiet presence a steadying influence as she navigated the social waters of her new home. She noted with pride the respect accorded to him by the other ranchers, despite his youth and relatively modest position. As the meeting concluded, and the ranchers dispersed to their various properties, one remained behind Franklin Sullivan, Lucas's employer. A tall, imposing man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and penetrating gray eyes, Sullivan approached George and Elizabeth as Lucas was seeing the last of the other guests out. "Miss Lawson," he said, bowing slightly, "a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard much about the young lady who's captured Hayes's attention so thoroughly." Elizabeth returned his greeting politely, though something in the older man's tone put her slightly on edge. "Mr. Sullivan, Lucas speaks highly of you." "Does he?" Sullivan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "He's a valuable employee, the best foreman I've had in 30 years of ranching. Would hate to lose him." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response to this oblique statement, Lucas rejoined them, his expression carefully neutral as he observed Sullivan's presence beside Elizabeth. "Mr. Sullivan," he acknowledged with a respectful nod, "I trust you found the meeting informative." "Indeed," the older rancher replied, his gaze sharp as it moved between Lucas and Elizabeth. "Most enlightening on several fronts. I was just telling Miss Lawson how indispensable you are to my operation." A flicker of something wariness perhaps crossed Lucas's face. "You're too kind, sir," George, sensing an undercurrent, smoothly intervened. "Sullivan, you must try some of Mrs. Holloway's apple pie before you leave. She'll be offended if you don't." As the two older men moved toward the house, Lucas remained with Elizabeth on the porch, his posture tense until Sullivan was out of earshot. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Mr. Sullivan seemed particular in his comments about you." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sullivan's not pleased about my plans to leave his employ eventually. He's made it clear he thinks I'm reaching above my station with the land purchase. And now there's me." Elizabeth completed the thought. He's a man who likes to control those around him, Lucas explained, his voice low. Doesn't take kindly to what he perceives as disloyalty, but his opinion doesn't matter to me, Elizabeth, not in this. Elizabeth reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Nor to me. But I wouldn't want to create difficulties for you. Lucas's expression softened as he looked at her. You've brought nothing but joy into my life. Any difficulties are a small price to pay for that. The moment was interrupted by Sullivan's return. The older rancher bid them a curt farewell, his parting glance at Lucas carrying a weight of unspoken warning that Elizabeth couldn't help but notice. He doesn't approve of me, she observed after Sullivan had ridden away. He doesn't approve of anything that might take me away from his ranch, Lucas corrected her. But my life is my own, and my choices are mine to make. The incident cast a temporary shadow over their courtship, but as March progressed into April and the landscape awakened with new life, their relationship deepened. Elizabeth found herself falling more deeply in love with Lucas with each passing day, appreciating his strength of character, his gentle ways with Liam, and the quiet passion that smoldered beneath his reserved exterior. For his part, Lucas made no secret of his feelings. You've changed everything, he told her one evening as they walked along the creek that bordered the Lawson property. Before I met you, I had my plans all laid out: get the land, build the ranch, make a home for Liam. Simple, straightforward, but now, Elizabeth prompted when he hesitated. Now I dream bigger, he admitted, stopping to face her. I see a future that's brighter, fuller than I ever imagined, a future with you in it if you'll have me. Elizabeth's heart soared at his words. Lucas Hayes, if that's a proposal, it's the most beautiful one I could imagine. His laugh was soft in the gathering dusk. Not quite yet. When I propose properly, I want to be able to offer you more than dreams and promises. I want to have something tangible to give you a home of our own. I don't need grand gestures or material offerings, Elizabeth assured him. Dreams and promises are enough if they're shared. Lucas took her hands in his expression serious. You deserve the best I can give. Just a little longer, the land deal is almost secured. Mr. Parsons has agreed to my final offer. By summer's end, I'll have the deed in hand. Elizabeth nodded, understanding his pride and his desire to provide for her properly. Then by summer's end, I'll be waiting for that proposal. The spring cattle drive brought a flurry of activity to the region as ranchers moved their herds to market. George was often away, leaving Elizabeth to manage the household affairs, a responsibility she embraced with growing confidence. Lucas, busy with Sullivan's cattle, had less time for visiting, but made it a point to ride over at least once a week, often bringing Liam with him. It was during one such visit in late May that Sullivan himself appeared unexpectedly at the Lawson ranch. Elizabeth was alone, George having ridden to a neighboring property to discuss a potential business arrangement. She was sitting on the porch, reading a letter from her friend in Topeka, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Sullivan dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, despite his years. He removed his hat as he approached the porch, his expression unreadable. Miss Lawson, he greeted her, forgive the intrusion. I was hoping to speak with your uncle. Elizabeth rose, maintaining a polite demeanor despite her discomfort. I'm afraid Uncle George isn't at home, Mr. Sullivan. He's expected back before supper if you'd care to wait. Sullivan considered this, then shook his head. Perhaps it's for the best. It's you I should be speaking with directly in any case. Alarm bells rang in Elizabeth's mind, but she kept her composure. Would you care for some refreshment? Mrs. Holloway has made lemonade. No, thank you. This won't take long. Elizabeth gestured to a chair, taking her own seat as Sullivan settled his large frame into the porch rocker. For a moment, he simply studied her, his gaze disconcertingly direct. You seem a sensible young woman, Miss Lawson, he began finally. Well educated from what Hayes tells me, so I'll speak plainly. Your involvement with my foreman is creating complications that benefit no one. Elizabeth stiffened at his presumption. With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, my relationship with Mr. Hayes is a private matter. Nothing is truly private in a community this size, Sullivan countered. And when it affects my business interests, I have every right to concern myself with it. How precisely does my friendship with Lucas affect your business interests? Elizabeth asked, unable to keep a note of challenge from her voice. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. Hayes is essential to my operation. He knows my methods, my breeding programs, my market strategies. He's also ambitious, a quality I admire, within reason. But his head has been turned by unrealistic dreams, and now by a young woman from the city who likely has no concept of the harsh realities of building a ranch from nothing. Elizabeth felt her temper rising, but kept her voice level. You underestimate both Lucas and myself, Mr. Sullivan, and you presume too much about our plans. Do I? The older man leaned forward, his manner becoming more intense. Let me be direct then. I came here today to make you an offer. I'm prepared to increase Hayes's salary substantially enough that he could afford a comfortable home in town for you and any family you might have. In return, he remains my foreman for a minimum of 5 years and abandons this foolish notion of competing with established ranchers like your uncle and myself. Shock and indignation rendered Elizabeth momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, it was steady with controlled anger. Mr. Sullivan, I find your offer both inappropriate and insulting. Lucas's dreams are not foolish, and my faith in his abilities is not misplaced. Furthermore, any decisions about our future will be made by the two of us alone, without interference from outside parties, however well-intentioned they may believe themselves to be. Sullivan's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Miss Lawson. The land Hayes wants to buy is marginal at best. One bad season could ruin him and you along with him. Is that the life you want? Struggling to survive, watching your husband work himself to death trying to prove something to the world? What I want, Elizabeth replied firmly, is a life with a man of integrity and determination, qualities that Lucas possesses in abundance. And I would rather face hardships by his side than enjoy comfort purchased at the price of his dreams. The rancher stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. You're as stubborn as he is. Very well, but remember this conversation when reality proves harsher than your romantic notions. With that, he jammed his hat back on his head and strode to his horse, mounting in a single fluid motion. He paused, looking back at Elizabeth with a gaze that had turned calculating. One last thing to consider, Miss Lawson. There are ways to acquire land beyond simply purchasing it outright. The Parsons property has certain complications that Hayes may not be aware of. It would be a shame if his investment proved worthless. Before Elizabeth could respond to this veiled threat, Sullivan wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving her shaken and concerned on the porch. She debated whether to tell Lucas about the encounter, not wanting to add to his burdens but also recognizing the potential seriousness of Sullivan's implied threat. In the end, honesty prevailed. When Lucas arrived 2 days later for his regular visit, Elizabeth recounted the conversation in full detail. Lucas listened with growing anger, his hands clenching into fists as she described Sullivan's offer and subsequent threat. The arrogance of the man, he muttered when she had finished. To come here to try to manipulate you this way. What did he mean about complications with the Parsons land? Elizabeth asked, focusing on the most troubling aspect of Sullivan's parting words. Lucas frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. I'm not sure. The title seems clear from everything I've seen. Parsons has owned it free and clear for 15 years. He shook his head. It's likely just an attempt to sow doubt. Sullivan doesn't make idle threats, but he's not above bluffing to get his way. Should we tell Uncle George? He might have insight, given his knowledge of local properties. Yes, Lucas agreed after a moment's consideration. George has been here longer than almost anyone. If there's something I should know about the Parsons place, he'd be aware of it. When George returned from checking the north pasture, they shared the story with him. The older man's expression grew increasingly grave as Elizabeth recounted Sullivan's visit and his thinly veiled threats. Franklin Sullivan is used to getting his way, George said when she had finished. Has been since he first came to the territory 25 years ago, not a man to cross lightly. Do you know of any issues with the Parsons property? Lucas asked directly. George stroked his beard thoughtfully. None that I've heard of. Old Parsons has his quirks, but he's honest as the day is long. His title came directly from the government, one of the original homestead grants. He paused, considering. There was some talk years back about water rights along the creek that borders his property to the east, but that was settled in court before you came to these parts, Lucas. The eastern border is shared with Sullivan's Range, Lucas noted, his expression troubled. Could that be what he's referring to? Possibly, George acknowledged. I'll make some inquiries discreetly. In the meantime, proceed with caution. Sullivan isn't known for making empty threats. The shadow of Sullivan's interference hung over them in the weeks that followed. Lucas redoubled his efforts to secure the land deal, meeting with Parsons to finalize the terms and visiting the bank in Ellsworth to arrange for the necessary funds. Elizabeth, for her part, threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch management, determined to be a true partner to Lucas in their future endeavors. June bloomed across the prairie, bringing lush growth and the promise of prosperous times ahead. George's cattle herd was thriving, and the first cutting of hay exceeded expectations. Elizabeth found herself falling in love not just with Lucas, but with the land itself, its vast horizons, its challenging beauty, the sense of possibility it evoked. On a particularly fine Saturday in late June, Lucas arrived at the ranch earlier than usual, dressed in his Sunday best rather than his work clothes. His expression was a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he asked George for a private word. Elizabeth, suspecting what was afoot, retreated to the garden to tend the roses that were now flowering profusely. She had barely begun deadheading the first bush when Lucas appeared at the garden gate, his hat in his hands and a smile lighting his features. "Would you walk with me?" He asked simply. Elizabeth nodded, setting aside her gardening shears and brushing the soil from her apron. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the creek that meandered along the property boundary, its banks lush with summer growth. Lucas led her to a spot where an ancient cottonwood provided shade against the June sun, its massive trunk and spreading branches creating a natural cathedral. Here he stopped, turning to face her with an expression so full of love that it took her breath away. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I found you in that snowstorm 6 months ago, I had no idea that I was finding my own heart as well. These months of knowing you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and joy not just to me, but to Liam too. You've believed in my dreams when others scoffed, and you've stood beside me against those who would see us fail." He took her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. "I come to you now, not as the man I hope to be someday, but as the man I am with all my flaws and limitations, but also with all the love and devotion in my heart. The land deal with Parsons will be finalized next week. It's not much yet, just acres of promise and potential, but it's a beginning. Our beginning, if you'll have me." Dropping to one knee, Lucas gazed up at her with naked hope in his eyes. "Elizabeth Lawson, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a life and a home with me, face whatever comes our way together, and allow me to love you for all the days we're granted on this earth?" Tears of joy sprang to Elizabeth's eyes as she looked down at this man who had come to mean everything to her. "Yes, Lucas Hayes." "With all my heart, yes." Lucas rose to his feet, his face transformed by happiness. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically as he tipped a simple gold band with a small pearl into his palm. "It was my mother's. My father saved for a year to buy it for her. It's perfect," Elizabeth whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. "More precious because of its history." Their first kiss as an engaged couple was tender and sweet, a promise of the shared life to come. When they finally drew apart, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed in evident contentment. "Your uncle has given his blessing," he told her. "Said he's never seen you happier than you've been these past months." "He's right," Elizabeth confirmed. "I never imagined finding such happiness when I set out for Ellsworth last winter." They returned to the house hand in hand, where George was waiting on the porch with a bottle of his best whiskey and 3 glasses. Mrs. Holloway, who had clearly been informed of the plan, emerged from the kitchen with a special cake she had prepared in anticipation of the occasion. To new beginnings, George proposed, raising his glass in a toast after pouring a small measure for each of them. And to family, the ones we're born to, and the ones we choose. The celebration was intimate but joyful, with George regaling them with tales of his own courtship of Elizabeth's Aunt Martha many years before. "She was as stubborn as you, Elizabeth," he chuckled. "Made me wait nearly a year before she'd agree to marry me. Smartest thing I ever did, convincing her to take a chance on a rough cowboy like me." Later that afternoon, Lucas rode to fetch Liam from the cabin, returning with his brother who was practically bursting with excitement at the news. The boy presented Elizabeth with a bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered along the way, his expression solemn as he formally welcomed her to their family. "Lucas says we'll be moving to our own ranch soon," he informed her earnestly. "Says you'll teach me about books and such, and I can help with the chickens and the garden." "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," Elizabeth agreed, touched by the boy's enthusiasm. "And perhaps you can teach me more about horses and cattle in return." As evening approached, Lucas reluctantly announced that they needed to head home. "I'll speak to Reverend Johnson tomorrow after service," he told Elizabeth as they stood on the porch. "See when he might perform the ceremony." "I don't want a long engagement," Elizabeth said decisively. "Once the land deal is complete, there's no reason to wait." Lucas's smile was tender as he gazed down at her. "Eager are we to begin our life together." "Absolutely." Their goodbye was lingering, filled with the sweet anticipation of the future they would share. As Elizabeth watched Lucas and Liam ride away, her heart felt so full she thought it might burst with happiness. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The land deal with Parsons was finalized as planned, with Lucas proudly showing Elizabeth the deed that made the property officially theirs. Together they rode the boundaries of their new ranch, planning where the house would stand, where corrals and outbuildings would be constructed, how the grazing land would be managed. "We'll start small," Lucas explained as they sat on a hillside overlooking the property. "A modest herd, carefully selected for quality rather than quantity, build slowly but solidly." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, content in the summer sunshine. "It's a good plan, and the cabin. I've been setting aside lumber for over a year," Lucas admitted with a slightly sheepish smile. "Buying it bit by bit, whenever I could afford a few extra boards. It's stored in Parsons's barn. With help from some neighbors, we could have the basic structure up before winter." The thought of their first winter together in a cabin of their own sent a pleasant shiver through Elizabeth. It will be perfect, no matter how simple. Their wedding was set for the second Saturday in August, a compromise between Elizabeth's desire for a quick ceremony and Lucas's insistence that they have time to prepare properly. George offered to host the celebration at his ranch, an arrangement that pleased everyone involved. As the date approached, a flurry of preparations consumed the Lawson household. Mrs. Holloway threw herself into planning the wedding feast, while George insisted on gifting the couple with a small herd of quality breeding cattle as a wedding present. 10 heifers and a bull, he declared when Lucas tried to protest the generosity of the gift. "It's the least I can do for the man who saved my niece's life and has made her happier than I've ever seen her." Elizabeth, with Mrs. Holloway's help, worked on her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk ordered from Chicago, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her mother's wedding gown. In the evenings, she and Lucas would sit on the porch swing, planning their future and sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence that had grown between them. It was during one such evening, just 2 weeks before the wedding, that Lucas arrived with a troubled expression that immediately put Elizabeth on alert. "What is it?" she asked as soon as they were alone. "Something's wrong." Lucas sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "I received a letter today from a lawyer in Topeka. It seems Sullivan is challenging the water rights on our property." Elizabeth felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "The issue Uncle George mentioned, but he said that was settled years ago." "It was," Lucas confirmed grimly. "But Sullivan is claiming that subsequent adjustments to the property line invalidated the original agreement." It's nonsense, a legal maneuver designed to drain my resources and delay our plans. Can he do that? Challenge something that's already been decided? He can try. And with his money and connections, he can make it a lengthy and expensive process, even if he ultimately loses. Lucas's expression was one of contained fury. This is what he meant by complications. He waited until the sale was final to make his move. Elizabeth took Lucas's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. What does this mean for our plans? I'll need to hire a lawyer, which I can ill afford right now with the building materials already purchased. He shook his head in frustration. The irony is that the water rights in question are for the smallest creek on the property, barely more than a seasonal trickle. But without clear rights to it, the value of that entire section of land is compromised. We'll figure it out together, Elizabeth assured him. Uncle George might know a good lawyer who wouldn't charge an exorbitant fee. Lucas nodded, though his expression remained troubled. I just hate the thought of starting our married life under this cloud. You deserve better than a husband embroiled in legal battles with a powerful enemy. What I deserve is the man I love, Elizabeth corrected him firmly. And that's you, legal battles and all. We knew Sullivan wouldn't make things easy for us. This changes nothing about how I feel or what I want. The strength of her conviction seemed to ease something in Lucas's demeanor. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. What did I do to deserve you, Elizabeth Lawson? You rescued a foolish woman in a snowstorm, she reminded him with a small smile. And then you made the even more foolish decision to fall in love with her. Best foolishness I've ever engaged in, he murmured, pulling her close. True to his word, George was able to recommend a capable lawyer in Ellsworth, who agreed to take on Lucas's case for a reasonable fee. The initial assessment was cautiously optimistic the previous court decision would likely be upheld, though the process might take several months. We'll proceed with our plans, Lucas decided after consulting with Elizabeth. Build the cabin, move the cattle onto the property. Show Sullivan that his tactics won't deter us. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of summer grass and wildflowers. Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window, watching the first golden rays of sunlight touch the distant hills, her heart full of quiet joy. Mrs. Holloway bustled in with a breakfast tray, clucking maternally as she set it on the small table. Can't have you fainting at the altar from hunger, she insisted. It's going to be a long day and a bride needs her strength. Elizabeth smiled gratefully, though butterflies of excitement left little room for appetite. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Holloway. I don't know how I would have managed without your help. The older woman's eyes grew suspiciously moist as she straightened Elizabeth's dressing gown. Been a pleasure, child. This house has needed a woman's laughter in it for too long. Though we'll miss you something fierce when you move to your own place. It's only a few miles away, Elizabeth reminded her. I'll visit often, see that you do. Mrs. Holloway patted her cheek affectionately. Now eat your breakfast. Your uncle's already pacing downstairs like expectant father. The morning passed in a flurry of activity as final preparations were made for the ceremony and celebration. Neighbors and friends from town began arriving shortly after noon, bearing gifts and well wishes. The Reverend Johnson arrived promptly at 2, setting up his Bible at the flower-decorated arch that had been erected in the garden. In her room, Elizabeth slipped into her wedding dress with Mrs. Holloway's assistance, her fingers trembling slightly with anticipation. The ivory silk fell in graceful folds to the floor, the lace at her throat and wrists adding an heirloom elegance to the simple design. You look like an angel, Mrs. Holloway declared, her voice thick with emotion as she arranged Elizabeth's auburn hair in a coronet of braids adorned with tiny white rosebuds from the garden. A knock at the door announced George's arrival. He entered at Elizabeth's call, stopping short at the sight of his niece in her bridal finery. Martha would be so proud, he said softly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. As would your parents. You're a vision, my dear. Elizabeth crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. Thank you for everything, Uncle George, for welcoming me into your home, for supporting my choices, for being the father I needed this past year. George cleared his throat, clearly moved by her words. It has been my honor and privilege, he said simply. Now I believe there's a young man downstairs who's about worn a path in my floorboards waiting for you. Shall we put him out of his misery? Elizabeth laughed, linking her arm through his. Yes, I believe we shall. The ceremony itself was everything Elizabeth had hoped for, simple, heartfelt, and surrounded by the beauty of the Kansas summer. Lucas, standing tall and handsome in a new suit, watched her approach with such naked adoration in his eyes that she felt her heart might burst with happiness. Liam, serving as best man, stood proudly at his brother's side, his young face solemn with the importance of the occasion. When it came time for the rings, he presented them with a formal bow that drew appreciative smiles from the assembled guests. I, Lucas James Hayes, take thee, Elizabeth Ann Lawson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Lucas vowed, his deep voice steady with conviction. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. As Elizabeth repeated the sacred words, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home to where she truly belonged. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas's kiss was tender yet filled with promise, sealing their commitment before God and their community. The celebration that followed was joyous and lively, with music provided by a local fiddler and his companions. Tables laden with food and drink had been set up in the yard, and lanterns hung from tree branches to illuminate the festivities as dusk approached. Elizabeth danced first with her new husband, then with her uncle, and finally with young Liam, who executed the steps with careful precision despite his nervousness. "Are you happy to be my sister now?" the boy asked earnestly as they moved around the improvised dance floor. "More than I can say," Elizabeth assured him with a warm smile. "We're going to have a wonderful life together, all three of us." As the evening progressed, Elizabeth noticed that one expected guest was conspicuously absent. Franklin Sullivan had received an invitation, a courtesy extended at George's insistence despite the ongoing water rights dispute, but had neither appeared nor sent his regrets. "Perhaps it's for the best," Lucas remarked when she mentioned it. "This day is too perfect to be marred by his presence." It was nearly midnight when the newlyweds took their leave, riding in a flower-bedecked buggy to the small but charming house in town that George had insisted they use for their wedding night and the few days following. Their new cabin, while progressing rapidly thanks to the help of neighbors, was not yet ready for occupation. "Welcome to married life, Mrs. Hayes," Lucas said softly as he carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner. Elizabeth wound her arms around his neck, gazing up at the man who was now her husband. "It's going to be a grand adventure, isn't it? With you by my side, the grandest." Their coming together that night was tender and passionate, a culmination of months of growing love and the promise of a lifetime of shared joy. As they lay entwined in the aftermath, the moonlight streaming through the window casting silver patterns across the bed, Elizabeth felt a profound contentment unlike anything she had ever known. "No regrets?" Lucas asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. About choosing this life, this place, Elizabeth propped herself up on one elbow to look into his eyes. "Not a single one. This is exactly where I'm meant to be with exactly the right person. The only regret I could ever have would be if I hadn't been thrown from my horse in that blizzard and found by the most honorable man I've ever known." Lucas pulled her close, his kiss a promise of all the days and nights to come. "Then I thank God for frightened horses and winter storms," he murmured against her lips, "and for stubborn, beautiful women who refuse to listen to reason and travel alone in blizzards." The following months brought both challenges and triumphs as the young couple established their new home and ranch. True to their plan, they started small, focusing on quality over quantity in their livestock and careful management of their resources. The water rights dispute dragged on through the courts, but their lawyer remained optimistic about the eventual outcome. The cabin, completed just before the first snow of winter, was modest but well built, with large windows that filled the interior with light and offered views of the rolling prairie. Elizabeth made it a home with carefully chosen furnishings, some brought from George's ranch. others crafted by Lucas's skilled hands, and a few special pieces ordered from catalogs and transported by wagon from the railroad station in Ellsworth. Liam thrived under Elizabeth's tutelage, his natural intelligence blossoming with regular lessons and access to the books she had brought from Topeka. He grew an inch taller that autumn, and his voice began to change, the first signs of the young man he was becoming. Franklin Sullivan remained a shadow over their happiness, his determination to complicate their lives manifesting in small but persistent ways. When Lucas sought to purchase additional cattle from a rancher to the north, Sullivan somehow convinced the man to sell to him instead. When Elizabeth applied to the town council to establish a small school on their property for neighboring children, anonymous concerns were raised about her qualifications and the suitability of the location. "He's testing our resolve," Lucas observed one evening in late November as they sat before the fire in their new home. "Seeing if he can wear us down with 1,000 small cuts rather than one decisive blow." Elizabeth, who was mending one of Liam's shirts, set her sewing aside to look at her husband. "He doesn't know who he's dealing with, does he?" Lucas smiled, the firelight highlighting the strong planes of his face. "No, he doesn't, especially not when it comes to my wife's determination." The winter of 1872-1873 proved to be milder than the previous year, allowing the Hayes family to establish their routines and strengthen their foundations without the additional challenge of severe weather. Their small herd weathered the season well, and by spring, the first calves were born on Hayes land, a tangible symbol of their growing prosperity. In April, as the prairie burst into bloom with wildflowers, the court finally ruled on the water rights dispute in Lucas's favor, as their lawyer had predicted. Sullivan was ordered to cease his interference and to pay court costs for both parties. "It's a clear victory," Lucas told Elizabeth and Liam over dinner the evening after receiving the news, "and an expensive lesson for Sullivan in the limits of his influence." "Do you think he'll accept the decision?" Elizabeth asked, still wary of the powerful rancher's determination. Lucas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "He'll have to, legally. Whether he finds other ways to make his displeasure known remains to be seen." Their answer came sooner than expected. 2 days later, as Lucas and Liam were repairing a section of fence on the eastern boundary of their property, the section adjacent to Sullivan's range, they were approached by the rancher himself, accompanied by his new foreman, a hard-faced man named Brock. "Hayes," Sullivan called out, reining his horse to a stop a few yards away. "I see you're busy improving my land." Lucas straightened, his posture alert but not overtly hostile. "This is Hayes' land, Sullivan, as the court confirmed 2 days ago." "Courts can be mistaken," the older man replied dismissively, "and documents can be lost or altered." His gaze shifted to Liam, who had moved closer to his brother's side. "Boys growing up. Shame if something were to happen that left him without family again." The implied threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Lucas's expression hardened, but he kept his voice level. "Careful, Sullivan. Threatening a man's family crosses a line that can't be uncrossed." Sullivan's laugh held no humor, just making an observation. "Life is uncertain, especially in these parts." He turned his horse, preparing to depart. "Consider my offer still open, Hayes. Sell this worthless patch of dirt to me for what you paid, come back to work at the Sullivan Ranch, and we can all live peacefully." "Not interested," Lucas stated flatly. "Not now, not ever." With a final calculating look, Sullivan rode away, his foreman following after casting a menacing glare in their direction. Lucas waited until they were well out of earshot before turning to Liam. "Ride home and tell Elizabeth what happened. Tell her to get the rifle ready, just in case. I'll finish up here and be along shortly." The boy nodded solemnly, mounting his pony without argument, a testament to how seriously he took the situation. When Lucas returned to the cabin an hour later, he found Elizabeth calmly cleaning the family rifle at the kitchen table, her expression resolute. "Liam told me," she said simply. "Sullivan has moved beyond legal harassment to outright threats." Lucas hung his hat by the door, his movements deliberate as he processed the confrontation. "It won't come to violence," he said with more confidence than he felt. Sullivan's too shrewd to risk the consequences of open aggression, but will need to be vigilant. That night after Liam was asleep, Lucas and Elizabeth sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Kansas sky. The spring air was cool but not uncomfortable, carrying the scent of new growth and promise. "I'm sorry," Lucas said quietly. "This isn't what I wanted for us living under threat, always looking over our shoulders." Elizabeth reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Don't apologize for Sullivan's actions. This is our home, our life. We've earned it honestly and will defend it the same way." Lucas raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Have I told you lately how much I love you, Elizabeth Hayes?" "You have," she replied with a soft smile, "but I never tire of hearing it." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the rhythmic chirping of crickets providing a peaceful backdrop to their thoughts. Eventually, Elizabeth spoke again, her voice hesitant but determined. "I've been meaning to tell you something." "I wanted to be certain before I said anything, but in light of today's events, I think you should know now." Lucas turned to look at her, curiosity and a hint of concern in his expression. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, a smile spreading across her face despite the seriousness of their situation. "We're going to have a baby. In late autumn, the doctor thinks." For a moment, Lucas seemed frozen in place, his eyes widening as he processed her words. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure and intense that it brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child." Elizabeth covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he assured her, gathering her into his arms. "I'm overjoyed, grateful, humbled, and more determined than ever to make this ranch a success, to create a legacy for our children." The news of the coming baby seemed to galvanize Lucas. Over the following weeks, he worked with renewed purpose, making improvements to the cabin, expanding their garden, and implementing breeding programs for their growing herd that would ensure long-term prosperity. The shadow of Sullivan's threats remained, but it was outshined by the light of their anticipated future. Word of Elizabeth's pregnancy spread quickly through the small community, bringing well wishes and practical gifts from neighbors. George was especially delighted at the prospect of becoming a great uncle, visiting more frequently and often bringing small treasures for the expected child: a handcrafted cradle, soft blankets woven by Mrs. Holloway, a silver rattle that had belonged to Elizabeth's father. Liam, after initial surprise, embraced the idea of becoming an uncle with enthusiasm, peppering Elizabeth with questions about babies and offering earnest if sometimes impractical suggestions for names. As summer progressed into early autumn, the Hayes Ranch began to truly take shape. A small but productive vegetable garden provided fresh produce for their table, while the orchard Lucas had planted in the spring showed promise for future harvests. The cattle herd, though modest in size, was healthy and well managed, with the quality of their stock drawing positive comments from neighboring ranchers. Elizabeth's body changed with the advancing pregnancy, her slender form softening and rounding in ways that Lucas found endlessly fascinating. Despite occasional discomfort, she maintained her active involvement in ranch operations, adapting her duties as needed but never using her condition as an excuse to withdraw from the work she had come to love. In late September, as the first hints of autumn color touched the cottonwoods along the creek, Elizabeth was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she noticed a plume of dust rising from the trail that led to their property. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she made out a single rider approaching at a steady pace. Lucas was in the north pasture with Liam, checking on a heifer that had shown signs of illness the previous day. Elizabeth considered calling for him, but the rider was already too close. Instead, she moved to the edge of the yard, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly as she waited to identify their visitor. As the horse drew nearer, Elizabeth recognized Brock, Sullivan's foreman, his hard features set in a grim expression that sent a chill down her spine despite the warmth of the day. "Mrs. Hayes," he greeted her curtly as he reined his mount to a stop a few yards away. His gaze flickered to her obviously pregnant state before returning to her face. "I'm looking for your husband. He's out checking the herd," Elizabeth replied, keeping her voice steady. "I can give him a message if you'd like." Brock dismounted, his movements deliberate as he looped his reins over the fence post. "I'll wait," he stated, taking a step toward her. Elizabeth stood her ground, though every instinct urged her to retreat. "Mr. Brock, I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business." "My husband doesn't welcome unannounced visitors from the Sullivan Ranch, given recent events." A cold smile touched the man's lips. "Smart woman, but not smart enough to convince your husband to take Mr. Sullivan's generous offer." He took another step forward, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered pistol. "Shame about that, especially now with a little one on the way." Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Lucas appeared around the side of the barn, riding hard, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Liam followed at a distance on his pony, clearly having been instructed to hang back. Lucas dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to Liam, who had caught up. "Take the horses to the barn," he instructed, his eyes never leaving Brock. "Then go inside and stay there with Elizabeth." But Liam began to protest. "Do as I say," Lucas cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. Elizabeth moved to join Liam, but Brock's voice stopped her. "Not so fast, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Sullivan sent me with a message for both of you." Lucas positioned himself between Elizabeth and the foreman, his stance protective. "Say what you came to say, then get off my land." Brock seemed unperturbed by Lucas's obvious anger. "Mr. Sullivan wants you to know that his patience is running out. The offer to buy this property expires at the end of the month. After that." He shrugged expressively. "Well, ranching is a dangerous business. Accidents happen, fires start, cattle disappear. Would be a shame if your family suffered because of your stubbornness." Lucas's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he maintained his control. "You tell Sullivan that threats against my family will only ensure that I never sell to him, not now, not ever. And if any harm comes to my wife, my brother, or my unborn child, there won't be a place on this earth where he can hide from me." The quiet intensity of his words carried more weight than any shouted threat could have. Brock's confidence seemed to waver for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before he masked it with bravado. "Your funeral," he muttered, turning back to his horse. As he mounted, he cast a final glance at Elizabeth, his expression calculating. "Pretty wife you've got, Hayes. Be a shame if anything happened to her." Lucas took a step forward, his control visibly slipping. "Get out, now." With a mocking tip of his hat, Brock wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The moment he was out of sight, Lucas turned to Elizabeth, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. "Are you all right? Did he threaten you before I arrived?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her heart was still racing from the encounter. "Just frightened by the implications." Lucas wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as Liam emerged from the barn, his young face tight with worry. "What are we going to do?" the boy asked, joining them in the yard. Lucas looked down at his brother, then at his wife, his expression resolute. "We're going to protect what's ours. But first, we're going to visit Uncle George. I want Elizabeth somewhere safe while I ride into town to speak with the sheriff." Within the hour, they were on their way to the Lawson ranch, traveling together rather than risking separation. George listened grimly to their account of Brock's visit, his normally genial expression hardening into anger. "This has gone far enough," the older man declared. "Sullivan's crossed the line from business rivalry to criminal intimidation. The sheriff needs to be informed." Lucas nodded in agreement. "My thoughts exactly. I'll ride to town now if you'll keep Elizabeth and Liam here until I return." "Of course," George assured him. "They'll be safe here. I've got 2 ranch hands staying in the bunkhouse and Mrs. Holloway's nephew is visiting a former army man with a steady aim." Lucas pressed a kiss to Elizabeth's forehead before departing, his expression a mixture of determination and concern. "I'll be back before dark. Try not to worry." But worry she did, pacing the parlor floor until Mrs. Holloway gently but firmly steered her to a chair with a cup of chamomile tea and strict instructions to rest for the baby's sake. Liam sat nearby, unusually quiet, his young face solemn as he whittled a piece of wood with the small knife Lucas had given him for his last birthday. The sun was low in the western sky when they heard a wagon approaching. George, who had been watching from the porch, came inside with welcome news. "It's Lucas, and Sheriff Taylor is with him." Elizabeth rose awkwardly from her chair, one hand supporting her lower back as she moved to the door. Lucas's face, as he helped her down the porch steps, was grim but determined. "Sheriff Taylor has agreed to pay Sullivan a visit," he explained, guiding her to a chair in the gathering dusk. "Make it clear that threats against private citizens won't be tolerated, no matter how influential the source." Sheriff Taylor, a weathered man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness, nodded in confirmation. "I've known Franklin Sullivan for 20 years. He's always pushed boundaries, but this goes beyond acceptable behavior. I'll speak to him directly tomorrow morning." "And if that doesn't stop him?" Elizabeth asked, voicing the fear they all shared. "Then we'll explore other options," the sheriff replied, his tone suggesting he was no stranger to dealing with difficult situations. "The law applies to everyone in this county, Mrs. Hayes, even to men like Sullivan." The conversation continued as darkness fell, with George insisting that Lucas, Elizabeth, and Liam remain at his ranch for the night. "Safety in numbers," he declared, "and we'll figure out a longer-term solution in the morning." That night, lying beside Lucas in the guest bedroom, Elizabeth couldn't shake her unease. What if Sullivan doesn't listen to the sheriff? What if he's too confident in his power to be deterred? Lucas drew her closer, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. "Then we'll stand together and face whatever comes. I won't let him win, Elizabeth, not when we've worked so hard for what we have." She pressed her face against his chest, drawing comfort from his steady heartbeat. "I'm not afraid for myself, but the baby, Liam. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to any of you because of this senseless feud." "Nothing will happen," Lucas promised, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. "We've faced challenges before and overcome them. We'll do the same now." Morning brought clear skies and a sense of cautious optimism as Sheriff Taylor set out for the Sullivan Ranch, promising to return with news before midday. Lucas used the time to discuss strategy with George, both men drawing on their years of frontier experience to develop contingency plans for various scenarios. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found herself drawn into Mrs. Holloway's kitchen activities, the familiar routines of baking and preserving offering a welcome distraction from her worries. Liam helped George's ranch hands with morning chores, his young face serious but determined. The sheriff returned shortly before noon, his expression giving little away as he dismounted in the yard. Lucas and George moved to meet him, with Elizabeth following at a slightly slower pace, her advanced pregnancy making quick movement challenging. "Sullivan claims his foreman was acting without authorization," Taylor reported without preamble. "Says Brock misunderstood his instructions, which were simply to extend a final purchase offer, not to make threats." "And you believe that?" Lucas asked skeptically. The sheriff shook his head. "Not particularly, but it gives Sullivan plausible deniability. He's fired Brock, supposedly as punishment for overstepping, though I suspect it's more about removing a potential witness against him." "So nothing changes," George concluded grimly. "Sullivan continues his campaign of intimidation with no consequences." "I didn't say that," Taylor corrected him. "I've made it clear to Sullivan that I'm watching him closely. Any further incidents involving the Hayes family will be thoroughly investigated, with no assumption of innocence on his part." Lucas exchanged a glance with Elizabeth, who had joined them in time to hear the sheriff's report. "It's something," he acknowledged, "but not enough to make me feel that my family is safe. Which is why I've taken the liberty of sending telegrams to a few colleagues in neighboring counties," Taylor continued. "Sullivan's influence extends beyond our borders, and I wanted to know if there have been similar complaints elsewhere." This revelation caught everyone's attention. "And," George prompted, a grim smile touched the sheriff's weathered face, "and it seems our Mr. Sullivan has a pattern of behavior that stretches back years. Nothing that ever led to formal charges, but enough complaints to establish a troubling history." I've documented everything, with copies sent to the territorial governor's office. Sullivan's been put on notice that any further incidents will trigger a more comprehensive investigation into his past activities. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. So he's been effectively warned off. For now, Taylor cautioned. Men like Sullivan don't change their nature overnight, but he's smart enough to recognize when the tide is turning against him. My guess is he'll back off for a time, regroup, perhaps try different tactics. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. We'll remain vigilant. And grateful for your intervention, Sheriff. As Taylor prepared to depart, he offered one final piece of advice. Strength in community is your best protection, Hayes. Make allies, build relationships with your neighbors. Sullivan's power comes partly from isolation, making people feel they stand alone against him. Together, you're stronger than he is. The sheriff's words resonated with Lucas and Elizabeth in the days that followed. After a night of discussion, they made the difficult decision to return to their own ranch rather than remaining under George's protection. We can't live in fear, Lucas explained to his concerned uncle-in-law. This is our home, our land. Abandoning it, even temporarily, feels like letting Sullivan win. George reluctantly agreed, but insisted on sending one of his most trusted hands, a quiet, capable man named Tom Wilson, to stay with them for a few weeks. Just until things settle, he said when Lucas began to protest. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. October arrived with a palette of golden hues across the prairie and a welcome absence of further threats from Sullivan or his men. Life on the Hayes Ranch settled into a rhythm of preparation for the coming winter, for the imminent birth, for the future they were building one day at a time. Elizabeth's time was increasingly occupied with readying their home for the baby's arrival. Lucas, with Liam and Tom's help, completed a small addition to the cabin that would serve as a nursery, carefully crafting a window to catch the morning light and shelves for books and treasures yet to be acquired. It's perfect, Elizabeth declared when the room was finally finished, her eyes misting as she took in the love evident in every carefully planed board and polished surface. Lucas wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands gently cradling her rounded belly. A proper place for our child to grow up, the first of many improvements we'll make over the years. The baby chose an auspicious day to make his entrance into the world, October 31, as the harvest moon hung full and golden in the clear autumn sky. Elizabeth's labor began in the early evening as she was preparing supper, a sudden sharp pain doubling her over at the stove. Lucas, who had been hyper-vigilant as her time approached, was at her side in an instant. Is it time? Elizabeth nodded, grimacing as another contraction followed quickly on the heels of the first. Sooner than we expected, the midwife said first babies usually take their time. Apparently our child is eager to meet us, Lucas replied with a forced lightness that didn't quite mask his concern. Liam, ride to town for Mrs. Brennan. Tom, head to George's place and let him know what's happening. The two departed immediately, leaving Lucas to help Elizabeth to their bedroom, his face a study in barely contained anxiety. What do you need? What can I do? Despite her discomfort, Elizabeth managed a smile at his obvious distress. Just stay with me. Everything else will unfold as it should. The labor progressed with unexpected speed. By the time Liam returned with Mrs. Brennan, the capable midwife who had attended most of Ellsworth's births for the past 15 years, Elizabeth was well advanced. This little one's in a hurry, Mrs. Brennan declared after her initial examination. Won't be long now, she was right. Just after midnight, as the clock in the main room chimed the first hour of November, Elizabeth gave a final tremendous push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that spoke of healthy lungs and a determined spirit. A fine boy, Mrs. Brennan announced, efficiently cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing him in Elizabeth's eager arms. Strong and perfect. Lucas, who had remained steadfastly by his wife's side throughout the ordeal, stared down at his son with undisguised wonder. He's beautiful, he whispered, gently touching the downy dark hair that covered the baby's head. Like his mother. Elizabeth cradled their child close, overwhelmed by the rush of love that filled her heart. "Hello, William George Hayes," she murmured, using the name they had chosen to honor both Lucas's father and Elizabeth's uncle. "We've been waiting for you." Lucas pressed a kiss to her damp forehead, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You were magnificent." "I've never seen anything braver than what you just did." Mrs. Brennan, who had discreetly busied herself with cleaning up, smiled at the tender scene. "I'll send young Liam in to meet his nephew if you're ready. He's been pacing the floor out there something fierce." Liam's reaction to the baby was a mixture of awe and trepidation. "He's so small," the boy whispered, carefully touching one tiny fist that had escaped from the blanket. "But his grip is strong." "Like his uncle," Lucas observed, pride evident in his voice for both his son and his brother. The days that followed were a blur of adjustment and joy as the Hayes family settled into their new reality. George arrived the morning after the birth, bearing gifts and offering heartfelt congratulations. Mrs. Holloway followed a day later, with meals prepared to last a week and practical advice delivered with motherly authority. News of William's arrival spread quickly through the community, bringing a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts and well wishes. Each was welcomed warmly, in keeping with the sheriff's advice about building community connections. Lucas found himself viewing the world differently through the lens of fatherhood. Every decision, every plan now centered around the tiny being who had so thoroughly captured his heart. The future, once an abstract concept of gradual improvement, now held a concrete purpose: to create a legacy of security and opportunity for his son. Elizabeth, recovering quickly from the birth, watched this transformation with loving understanding. "He already has everything he truly needs," she reminded Lucas gently one evening as they stood over William's cradle, watching him sleep. "A father who loves him, a mother who would move mountains for him, an uncle who adores him, and a family united in their commitment to his happiness." Lucas nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words even as he continued to dream of all he would provide for his child in the years to come. "And he'll never know the kind of loss that Liam and I experienced," he added softly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." As winter settled over the prairie once more, bringing shorter days and long, firelit evenings, the Hayes household found a new rhythm centered around William's needs. Elizabeth discovered unexpected reserves of energy despite interrupted sleep, her love for her son providing motivation that transcended physical limitations. Liam proved to be an enthusiastic, if sometimes overzealous assistant, eager to help with his nephew's care and endlessly fascinated by each small development: the first real smile, the strengthening ability to hold up his head, the increasing periods of alertness during which William seemed to absorb everything around him with wide, curious eyes. The threatened trouble from Sullivan never materialized. Whether due to the sheriff's intervention or some calculation of his own, the powerful rancher maintained a wary distance, neither approaching the Hayes property nor sending representatives. Lucas remained vigilant, but gradually allowed himself to hope that perhaps the worst of the conflict was behind them. Christmas arrived with a blanket of fresh snow and a sense of profound gratitude for the blessings of the past year. George joined them for the holiday, bringing presents for everyone and spending long hours simply holding his great-nephew, a contentment in his expression that Elizabeth had never seen before. "This is what it's all about," the older man observed as they gathered around the fire after Christmas dinner. "Family, connection, leaving something of yourself behind when your time comes." Lucas, seated beside Elizabeth with William sleeping peacefully in his arms, nodded in agreement. "I understand that better now than I ever could have before." As the new year of 1874 dawned, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, the Hayes family looked toward the future with confidence tempered by the wisdom of their experiences. The ranch was growing slowly but steadily, their community connections strengthening with each passing month, and their home increasingly filled with the laughter and love that transforms a simple dwelling into something sacred. One crisp February morning, nearly a year after Elizabeth's arrival in Ellsworth, Lucas found her standing on the porch, William bundled against her chest as she gazed out over their snow-covered land. The rising sun cast a golden glow across the pristine white landscape, creating a scene of breathtaking beauty. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. Elizabeth turned to him with a smile that still had the power to quicken his pulse. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if Penny hadn't thrown me that day in the snow, if you hadn't come along when you did." Lucas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her and William close against his side. "I prefer to think it was always meant to be this way, that somehow we would have found each other even if circumstances had been different." "A romantic notion," Elizabeth teased gently, though her eyes reflected the same sentiment, "from my practical, level-headed husband." "You've changed me," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "In all the ways that matter most." William stirred against Elizabeth's chest, his small face turning toward the sound of his father's voice with an expression of such perfect trust that it never failed to humble Lucas. "And you," Elizabeth said, looking down at their son, "have taught us both what truly matters in this life." As they stood together in the bright morning light, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, Elizabeth was struck by the perfect circularity of their story from that desperate day in the snow to this moment of profound contentment. The journey had not been easy, with threats and challenges testing their resolve at every turn, but each obstacle overcome had only strengthened the bonds between them. "What do you see when you look out there?" Lucas asked, following her gaze across their property. Elizabeth considered the question, taking in the barn and corrals, the smoke rising from the chimney of their cabin, the distant line of trees marking the creek's path. "I see home," she answered simply. "I see the place where we belong." Lucas nodded, understanding completely. "And beyond that." "What do you see for our future?" A smile touched Elizabeth's lips as she contemplated the years ahead. "I see William growing strong and tall, learning to ride and to read with equal enthusiasm. I see Liam becoming a fine young man, perhaps with a ranch of his own someday. I see us growing old together, watching the seasons change, building something lasting. Children," Lucas suggested, a hopeful note in his voice. "At least one more," Elizabeth agreed with a laugh. "Perhaps a daughter with your eyes." Their conversation was interrupted by Liam bursting through the door, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Lucas, the new calf, the one from the spotted heifer, it's arrived. Tom says it's the finest he's seen this season." Lucas grinned at his brother's enthusiasm. "Well then, we'd better go see this marvel, shouldn't we? Elizabeth, will you and William join us? We wouldn't miss it," she assured him, following as Lucas and Liam set off toward the barn, their boots crunching in the snow. As they walked, Elizabeth reflected on how far they had come from that fateful day when her horse had thrown her into a snowdrift and a blue-eyed cowboy had lifted her onto his saddle. What had begun as a rescue had transformed into a partnership, a family, a shared vision of a future built on love and determination. The path ahead would not always be smooth. There would be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, perhaps even old adversaries to confront again. But they would face whatever came together, stronger for the trials they had already endured, and sustained by a love that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. For now, though, there was a new calf to admire, a son to nurture, a brother to guide, and a home to build day by day, season by season, with patience and purpose and unwavering commitment to each other. It was more than enough. It was everything.